mother came from Russia, a satchel on her knee. My grandfather had his father's cap he brought from Italy. They'd heard about a country where life might let them win. They paid the fare to America and there they melted in. Lovely Lady Liberty with her book of recipes and the finest one she's got is the Great American Melting Pot, the Great American Melting Pot.
America was founded by the English,
but also by the Germans, Dutch, and French.
The principle still sticks, our heritage is mixed. So any kid could be the president.
You simply melt right in. It doesn't matter what your skin, it doesn't matter where you're from or your religion. You jump right into the Great American Melting Pot, Great American Melting Pot. Ooh, what a stew, red, white, and blue. America was the new world and Europe was the old. America was the land of hope, or so the legend told. On steamboats by the millions in search of honest pay, those 19th century immigrants sailed to reach the USA. Lovely Lady Liberty with her book of recipes and the finest one she's got is the Great American Melting Pot, the Great American Melting Pot. What good ingredients, liberty, and immigrants. They brought their country's customs, their language, and their ways. They filled the factories to the soil, helped build the USA. Go on and ask your grandma, hear what she has to tell. How great to be American and something else as well. Lovely Lady Liberty with her book of recipes and the finest one she's got is the Great American Melting Pot, 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 the Great American Melting Pot.
Immigration really got started in 1870 until about 1920 when 20 million immigrants came from Europe. And most of these European immigrants would come to the East Coast, and the reason that they would come is because of religious persecution or because of overpopulation in Europe. The population had doubled in Europe from about 1800 to 1900, so people wanted a new place to live. Not just Europeans came over, we also had Chinese and Japanese arriving on the West Coast. From 1850 to 1883, we saw about 300,000 Chinese immigrants arrive. When they came, they were looking for gold, and they also started to work on the railroads. The real boom of Japanese immigrants started when the U.S. annexed Hawaii. Immigrants also came from the West Indies and Mexico. They came from places like Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands. There was not many jobs in those areas, so that's why they came to the United States. Mexican immigrants came in 1902 after the National Reclamation Act, when we were trying to get people to irrigate land in the West. This was kind of the perfect opportunity for Mexicans to come immigrate north. Roughly 7% of the Mexican population actually immigrated. The trek over to the United States was a hard one for most people. Most of them were poor, and crossing the Atlantic took about a week. Crossing the Pacific took 3. Because they were poor, they often had to stay in the steerage section of the ship. That is where the cargo was held. If you had a steerage ticket, you couldn't come on deck. And with all those people down there, disease started to infest the areas where they were being held, and it would have been very, very hard. When they finally arrived, however, they were greeted at Ellis Island. At Ellis Island, over 17 million immigrants came into the United States. Most people were admitted, only 2% were actually turned down once they reached Ellis Island. This was a little different than the West Coast, because on the West Coast they came through Angel Island. When you got here, you had to take a physical examination by a doctor, and you also had to report to a government inspector. The government inspector would check for things such as legal requirements. You couldn't have been convicted for a felony from where you were from. You had to be able to work, and you also had to have at least some sort of money. At Ellis Island, it was about $25 to be admitted into the United States. I mentioned that on the West Coast they had Angel Island. This wasn't as friendly as Ellis Island. About 50,000 Chinese immigrants were admitted into the United States at this time. They came through the West Coast by San Francisco Bay. Like I said, this wasn't quite like Ellis Island. They faced much tougher questions, and they were kept in dirty and bad barracks. A lot of people had different viewpoints on the immigrants in America. The video you saw before, the Schoolhouse Rock video, kind of talked about a melting pot, and that's how the immigrants saw the United States. They saw these different cultures coming together, but many of the native-born Americans didn't see it that way. They didn't like the immigrants coming and using their own cultures and customs. They wanted them to adopt the American way of doing things, and we call this nativism, a favoritism towards native-born Americans. Not only did many Americans not like the immigrants, they also didn't like the religion the immigrants brought over, especially the Jews and the Catholics. If you remember, many of the important people that founded America were Protestant, and so people believed that with all the Catholics coming over, it was going to kind of ruin the American spirit. And Jews were being persecuted all over the world, and that didn't change when they came to America. Because of all this hatred, there were stronger immigration laws that started to be brought up, especially in Congress. The first one came in 1896 with a bill that was started by the Immigration Restriction League. They tried to make literacy a big focal point for immigrants. They wanted them to be able to read, and especially in English. This was vetoed by Cleveland, and it was also vetoed by Woodrow Wilson, who was another president, but the same bill was passed even though both of them had vetoed it. One of the biggest reasons anti-immigration feelings were so strong was because immigrants were working for cheaper wages. This was especially strong in California. There was a big depression in 1873, and many people had trouble finding work. And one of the reasons they had trouble finding work is because many of the Asian immigrants in that area were finding cheap jobs, and people didn't want to work for as cheap as they would work. This led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This banned entry of all Chinese except for students, teachers, merchants, and tourists for 10 years. This bill was extended in 1892 for another 10 years, and then in 1902 it was extended for good, so there was no Chinese immigrants until actually 1942. The Japanese immigrants were facing just as strong segregation once they got into America, especially in San Francisco. That brings us to the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 and 1908, where the government agreed to limit immigrants of unskilled workers if the U.S. stopped all of the hatred towards them. So now we have a bunch of the immigrants in the United States, and we see a big increase in urbanization, which is the growth of cities. People were leaving the farms because with all the new inventions for farmers, they really didn't have to have all the hands in the farms. There wasn't a need for as much help, when in the past there needed to be a lot of people to make a farm work. With these new inventions, they only needed a couple people. So those people that used to work on the farms started to move towards the cities. Like we talked about earlier, the cities were really trying to practice Americanization, and that's assimilating people of wide-ranging cultures into the dominant culture. So in this case, we're looking at Germans, Austro-Hungarians, Irish, Italian, Russian, and Scandinavian people, and they're trying to assimilate them into American culture. The main place where this Americanization was taking place was in most of the schools. But with all this urbanization and people moving into the cities, it really caused a lot of problems. One of the big problems was housing. If you wanted to buy a house in the city, it had to be on the outskirts of town, but that made travel hard. So if you wanted to live inside the city, you'd have to rent in overcrowded apartments or row houses, where a single family would live side by side with another family. There was usually just one wall in between where the two families' houses were. A big problem with all of these houses, like the row houses, is that just like with jobs, the immigrants started to take over these crowded housing developments. And when the immigrants would take them over, they often would have other families come and live with them in those houses. So sometimes there would be up to 3 different families in the houses, and we would call these tenements, where the immigrants lived. Transportation was very necessary in the urban areas now that it was becoming so populated. But if you remember when we talked about electricity not just being at rivers anymore, they could harness that and make electric streetcars. That helped people get from their house to work. And that also kind of helped the housing problem because not everyone had to live so close into the city. Eventually this leads to automobiles and the development of the suburbs. Another problem with the cities besides housing and transportation was sanitation. The water was really bad in the cities and often spread disease. A filtration system wasn't put into place until the 1970s or the 1870s, and that really helped control the disease that was spreading. When you also had so much horse travel, there was a lot of horse manure in the streets and raw sewage flowing through the open gutters. Crime and fire, which is still found in cities today, was especially prevalent back then. When we looked at natural resources, we looked at kerosene as being a big deal, and a lot of their heat was produced by using kerosene heaters, and that was a big fire hazard. So really, with all the negatives happening, there really were people trying to make city life better for not only the Americans but also immigrants. The social gospel movement was established to try and help the poor and the immigrants in the cities find housing. The government houses were founded by Charles Stover and Stanton Coit in New York City in 1886. One other important figure in the housing movement was Jane Addams, and she was able to create the whole house, which helped immigrants and poor people find housing in one of the bustling cities of the time, Chicago.